them.
Okay. All right, so it's starting.
I'm learning all kinds of stuff here. I guess I might as well, because I'm probably going to be on Zoom a lot in the next couple.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is called Bring It In, True Hoops Daily Experiment in David Epstein's virtual backgrounds. David Thorpe is here. David Epstein, you're actually in your house in Washington, D.C., but it looks like you're in an art exhibit. What's the background we got here?
Yeah, it's from the National Gallery of Art. It's an exhibit by Yayoi Kusama, one of my favorite artists. She's brilliant.
Cool.
And in this one, the room's all white. Yeah, and you get in, you go in, you get to have stickers, and you can put them wherever you want. There's like pianos and paintings, and then of course you go in, you wonder like, how did someone get one that's 13 feet high? Like, was Kevin Garnett in this exhibit or something like that? So it's pretty interesting to see what people accomplish with those stickers.
That's great. I really enjoy it. It's very happy.
Cool.
So you're the second guest for whom I've actually prepared. We have actual notes. I'm pretty pleased about that. Right now, you're doing tons of work on this convalescent plasma project. Can you explain how that started and how it's going?
Yeah, so the way it started was a guy named Arturo Casadevall, who I happened to profile in the last chapter of my book, Range, is the head of immunology at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And he's also a massive reader outside of his field and in history and a lot of history of science. And right when, in January already, when he saw the pandemic developing in other countries, he said, you know what, we're going to end up unprepared. We're going to end up in essentially the pre-vaccine era as far as this disease is concerned. And having read a lot about science history, he said what people used to do before vaccines to try to stem outbreaks, especially of things like measles, which is far more contagious actually than coronavirus, was to take the blood plasma, so that's the liquid part of the blood, not the blood cells, from people who had recovered and give it to people who are ill or who may become ill. That's because the reason you have immunity after you're sick is because you've produced antibodies that fight the infection. And so once you've produced those, that can be like medicine then given to another person who hasn't made those antibodies yet. And so it can, treat them if they're already ill, or there's going to be a trial seeing can healthcare workers who take it be less likely to get ill. And one of the things about this is it's everyone's saying 12 to 18 months until we have a vaccine. That would be that would be great, but that would be a world record, right? And we don't necessarily know if that's true, right? Like, we don't have a vaccine for the common cold. It's not a given that we will have a vaccine, and it's not going to be super quick. This can be deployed really quickly. In fact, the first patients have been treated just this week. And because there are already institutions geographically spread all over the country, this collaboration is now 34 institutions, plus 2 pharmaceutical companies, plus Amazon helping with logistics. And they're already set up for blood collection and blood storage. And so this is kind of the fastest possible stopgap treatment that could be widespread throughout the country. And I was sort of brought into it because I had written about the leader of it and knew another one of the team leaders named Mike Joyner at the Mayo Clinic. And they brought me in to help sort of network for funding and for publicity. And then I brought you in to help network for funding and publicity. And that's one reason why I think the NBA is frequently associated with this topic now, because they made a financial donation, and also some of the players, I guess teams got a memo encouraging players who had recovered to donate, and Marcus Smart just announced that he's gonna donate. And so I think, from Arturo Casadevall and Mike Joyner to me to you, we've sort of helped get the NBA involved with this convalescent plasma project.
Smart blood. Like, he's built a certain way where things have been bouncing off him for 20 years. That's going to be it's non-scientific, but I feel like he's there's some memes Celtics fans have created of the coronavirus failing to register with him, right? His body was just like, no, it's fine. I'm totally fine.
I saw somebody, when I was tweeting about it, somebody tweeted at me if he can make other men who spent their whole life playing basketball give up on attempting offense within 10 minutes, I'm sure he can do the same to the coronavirus, despite its previous success.
Fact. People might be interested in donating. What's the procedure for that?
Yeah, if they're interested in donating plasma, and by the way, I should say, let me pull the website up. If you go to donate plasma, so if you've recovered, and you even if you think you recovered, so the website is CCPP, so like cat, Peter, 19.org. That's the website for the National COVID-19 Convalescent Plasma Project. And you just click the link that says donate plasma. And you'll see where you can register to be a donor, and you put your information in. It's really simple. It takes like 1 minute. It's basically your name, your location, and they can reach out to you. And if you go and donate, let's say they find, oh, you don't have a lot of antibodies, and so maybe you're not the best plasma donor. Turns out we're having a shortage of normal blood donation at the same time. So if you end up being a donor, your blood will be used for something. Because you're maybe starting to see the ads from the Red Cross. There's now beginning to be like a serious normal blood shortage.
Mm-hmm.
So you may end up being a plasma donor, which is great. You may end up doing something good anyway, even if it turns out that you don't have a lot of antibodies at the time. So I think, even if it turns out you're not a perfect candidate for this project, you're still going to do something worthwhile.
So I think I know a lot of people who suspect they've had coronavirus, but don't really know because they were never tested.
Yeah.
Should they be signing up for this?
I'm going. I think I probably did not have coronavirus, but I think there's a chance. I was a little bit sick. It would have been early in the epidemic, but I'm going to sign up for it because of that.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then I'll probably just end up donating normal blood because I know there are these big shortages now.
Yeah.
As donation has gone way down and staff are occupied with other things, and so
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's, and hopefully soon we'll have a serum hopefully soon we'll have the test that can show if you had it in the past,
Right.
not just if you have it now. And so if you sign up, that may come online anytime now, because that's being done for donors, right? So you may go in and get screened and they'll tell you, oh, in fact, you did have it in the past.
Yeah.
And I expect that test to hopefully become more widespread really soon.
Is it happening outside the US too?
China is doing some of this same project. They have published what's called preprints. That means like some scientific papers that haven't been peer reviewed, but everything's going out fast. Have tested a very small number of patients with convalescent plasma, and what the data look like so far are that it may help because it hasn't been a blinded randomized trial where you have a control group that are getting placebo. We can't say for sure that it helped, but it appears to have helped those patients, and there were no adverse side effects, which is really good. So it seems to have been useful in some past pandemics. There's some suggestive evidence that it's been useful so far in China. Need to run real trials to figure that out, which is part of what the early donors will be, their plasma might be included in trials. And so far, the fact that there have been 0 reported adverse side effects is a really good sign.
Just while we have you on this topic, before we get a bunch of stuff from your amazing book range, I think you're dialed into the science a little bit of this, like suggestion that the dose of your exposure might matter to the severity of your illness.
Yeah.
There was a great New Yorker story about that last week. What do we know about that?
I think there are kind of a lot of people saying a lot of different things about that, and I think that's reflective of the fact that we don't totally know for sure, but that there are some reasonable suggestions. So I guess we know it matters to some extent, right? Like, you're going to be exposed to a very small amount of a virus and you probably won't get sick at all, which is one reason why you may actually be exposed to it just when you're outside in the air, even if you're not within 6 feet of someone, and not get it because it won't be enough. The degree to which that so-called infectious dose predicts like how sick you'll get, I think is unknown, but I think there's some plausible arguments that people are saying, well, if you get this big dose, the infection will get going much more rapidly than you can sort of respond to it. And that could be bad either because your immune system doesn't get going quickly enough, or your immune system starts going so hard that you can have sort of an over response. So I don't think we know for sure. But I think it makes sense. And people are suggesting this infectious dose might be important.
I like this. The New Yorker story had this suggestion basically with cancer patients, they schedule half an hour for like, here's how we're going to treat your exact case, right? Because it's different for everyone, right? And the idea is that there could be such a thing where instead of a binary like infected, not infected, we could say, okay, look, early from a nasal swab, early in your infection, we predict you're going to go on this path, which will have this set of therapies, as opposed to that path where you just go home and drink Gatorade, right?
Yeah, I mean, that would be super helpful. I think right now things are happening so rapidly and people are trying to cover their bases that we are not there yet. Basically, that's much more happening just based on someone's symptoms, or also like I was looking at the data out of New York yesterday because New York is the big hotspot, obviously. And again, it's hard to know a lot of what's going on without like some random testing, right? We don't really know how many people have this. Even deaths are getting updated sort of, when things are changing so much a day at a time, we're behind. But it looked like many more of the deaths than I expected were concentrated in people with underlying conditions. The number of deaths for people who didn't have underlying conditions, which included like kidney disease, diabetes, asthma, cancer, or like immunosuppression that could be lung disease, or immunosuppression that could be related to being treated for cancer. The deaths outside of those were not zero, but they were very, very low. And so I think probably for the meantime, since we have to do things so fast, one of the more useful screening ways is like, what underlying condition do you have? And that'll probably be more useful in the very short term because, you can get that information instantly,
Minute one,
basically.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think I've been holding back David Thorpe, who's bursting with enthusiasm to talk about a lot of stuff. So why don't well, David, I'm flicking the switch on. Go.
Thank you. And Henry has set me up, David, with a lot of these things because of his more intimate knowledge of everything you've written and talked about. But like I said, I've been watching you all morning. But to begin with, you and I talked before we went on air. You have a 1-year-old child.
Yeah.
And so now you get to practice what you preach in a sense. How do you see that parenting style again? One, but how do you see that happening in terms of how you've thought about it and everything?
Yeah, I'm going to feel free to interrupt me because I've been thinking about this recently because I was writing an afterword for Range that is the book. Between the time I finished the book and the time it was published is when I became a parent.
Right.
And so I started thinking about the research a lot more, explicitly as a parent. And now I realize that anyone who is a parent who reads it will see it through that lens to a much greater degree than I realized while I was writing it. But so sort of two main threads I kind of pull out in the afterword. One has to do with expanding on something that's only a footnote on page 140 at the moment called the Army's talent-based branching program. And I sort of liken my prospective parenting strategy to this. That sounds bad, right? It's like I liken it to like the Army and my parenting strategy, but it's a structural analogy. I talk a lot about analogies in the book. It's not a surface analogy. And
you're not raising an army. That's not what you're doing.
Or a soldier.
And by that I mean he will be in uniform every morning. No.
Made bed.
So the program was started by the Army when they realized, starting in about the early mid-1990s, they started losing the people that they identified as the most talented future officers and who they gave scholarships and all these things. In fact, the more money they gave someone in scholarship, the more likely that person was to quit as soon as possible. So it's kind of backward how they wanted. And long story short, that turned out to be that in sort of the knowledge economy, there's way more lateral mobility for people to move between jobs than there was when we were a more industrial economy and people were sort of facing the same challenge over and over and over, and specialization was really, really prized. And so these young people who are very talented would learn things about themselves in their late teens and early 20s, as one does. In fact, time from about 18 to your late 20s is the fastest time of personality change in your whole life. And so that's usually when we're exactly like telling people they need to, pick something and settle down. There's something called the end of history illusion I write about, which is this idea that when you ask people, have they changed a lot in the past based on their experiences, everyone says yes. And then they say, but I'm pretty much done. And we say that at every time point in life, and you always underestimate it. So it's really funny. But anyway, so they learn things about themselves and realize that they didn't have any agency to change what they were doing or explore new interests based on what they were learning about themselves in the Army. So they would leave and go somewhere else. And so when the Army sort of realized that's what was happening, first they tried to throw money at these recruits to keep them, retention bonuses, and the people who were going to stay took it. The people who were going to leave left anyway. It was $500 million taxpayer money, didn't change retention 0.1%. So just thrown down the drain. But taxpayer money, so who cares? And then they started these programs like this one called talent-based branching, where instead of saying, here's your career track, get up or out, they pair the cadets with sort of coach-like mentors. And they let them dip their toes into one career track, and then they reflect on how that fits them with their coach and mentor. Like, what strengths did they have that they didn't anticipate? What weaknesses did they have they didn't anticipate? They keep track of that in an online portal. And in fact, the research that followed them says the students are almost ubiquitously surprised by some of the things that they are good and bad at when they try them. And so then they'll go and dip their toes into a couple more different career paths. And so they get a sense of one, what their colleagues are doing, what some of their options are. 90% of the cadets who went through talent-based branching changed one of their top 3 career choices. 90%, right? Because they don't know until they have some exposure to these things. And that improved retention where money bonuses couldn't. The option of trying different things and finding out what you might be good at. And so as a parent, I view my role sort of like that coach, like mentor, where I'm going to arrange, a way to test different things, different sports, different activities. That's always going to be limited, right? You can't like expose someone to an unlimited amount of stuff. And I think the best I can do in each of those situations is help the kid get the maximum amount of signal about themselves, what they're good at, what options they have from each one of those experiences. That's partly called self-regulatory learning. I wrote about this a little bit in the Sports Gene very briefly. These studies in the Netherlands that looked at kids in sports and school and everything. And there were physiological things you needed. Like some of the kids that were tracked from the time they were 12 went on to become pro soccer players, who were on the Netherlands teams that I think finished top 4 in 2
really good, right.
World Cups. And you'd see them at age 12, they'd be the kids. So if you couldn't hit 7 meters a second in a sprint, you weren't going to make it to the top level in soccer, period. Like there were physiological requirements. But the kids that also like didn't plateau, they'd be the ones in these videos where they'd be going to the coach like, why am I doing this drill again? I've already mastered this thing, but I'm not that good at this other thing I want to try. Like, what am I learning from this? And the coaches are like, oh, can you just like get back in line and do it? And it seems annoying, but they're like,
oh my God, I know that kid. I was that kid.
They're like taking accountability for their learning. Or the woman who led these studies, her name is Mariah Elfring-Gemser. And so self-regulatory learning in large part means reflecting on what you're doing, because apparently we don't just intuit all of our lessons. Reflecting on what you're doing and saying, was this too easy? Which means that it might feel good, but you're not actually learning anything. Was it so hard that like it was just impossible for you? Because if you're not screwing up about at least 15% of things that you're trying, then it's too easy for you and you're not learning enough. And so they keep evaluating themselves, and they come to evaluate their own strengths and weaknesses much more similarly to how their coaches do compared to other kids. And so I think promoting that reflection, that self-regulatory learning through these different experiences, which is like what the online portal with the Army is doing, and the Coach Like Mentor is sort of the role that I see myself playing. And there's another second prong to this answer, but it already got longer than I expected, as always.
No, I want the second prong. We need the second prong.
Can't tease us.
The second prong.
Dang it.
The second prong. As I always say, I have a very digressive brain, and so in books, I like really have to try to organize it on the page to make people think I'm somewhat organized in my head. But so I was
having Henry as an editor. Because I'm the same way. I have the same
just putting
problem.
stickers on the wall in the gallery. Just put a sticker over here, a sticker over there.
Everyone
all the stickers. Looks great.
Everyone needs an editor. It's just a good thing that
sure.
most people don't get to see our early drafts. And so I get a lot of email from, as I was saying before we started recording, from parents who have questions about prodigies. Specifically, the questions are usually something like, I saw my kid do this. Does that mean they're a prodigy? And if I don't do X other things, that they won't develop into a prodigy, basically. And I think that comes from, I think we tell the most famous prodigy stories a little bit wrong. So like I open Range with the story of Tiger Woods, and obviously it's very much of the 10,000 hours story, early specialization. Right. But the part that we usually leave out of that story is that in 2000, Tiger Woods said, my father's never once asked me to play golf. I was always the one bugging him. It's the child's desire to play that matters, not the parent's desire to have the child play. And when Earl Woods gave Tiger a putter at 7 months old, Tiger was very physically precocious, by the way. It wasn't just like a normal, there are pictures in Earl's book of Tiger balancing on his palm when he's 6 months old, like standing. Yeah. My kid's 1 and he's still not like totally walking on his own. And that doesn't mean he won't be like a good walker when he grows up or anything. Not. But anyway, he was physically precocious. Right. And so when Earl gave him this putter, it was just as a toy. He wasn't saying like, go become a golfer. He was just giving it to him to play around with, and was surprised when he saw Tiger start swinging it when he was about 10 months old and imitating swings. And so it was really Earl at first reacting to this very unusual kind of display of interest and physical prowess from his son. And so he responded first. He didn't like say, I'm going to make him a great golfer first. Similarly, I think the second most impactful, like the story that gets in, even if you don't know the specifics, kind of are in the cultural ether, is Mozart, right? But Mozart's, whose father also facilitated an incredible amount of practice. But I went back through a bunch of letters about Mozart's life when I was doing reporting, and there's one that like really struck me, for example, where this musician named Andreas Schachner, Johann Andreas Schachner, who was a good family friend of the Mozart's and a professional musician. He recounts to Mozart's sister coming over to play one day with Leopold Mozart, the father of the family.
Yeah.
And little Wolfgang comes in and says, "Hey, I want to play second violin part with you guys." And Mozart's dad, Leopold, is like, "What? You haven't had any lessons? Like, get out of here. You obviously can't play violin. Go away." And Wolfgang starts crying, right? And so Schachner says, "I'll go play with him, so that he'll calm down." And Leopold's like, "Fine, but just keep it down." And next thing you know, they hear the second violin part coming. And so the adults are like, "What?" They go in and are sort of awestruck. And then Schachner recounts, and this part's basically verbatim from the letter. He says, "Little Wolfgang was emboldened by our applause to insist he could also play the first violin part." And then he plays the first violin part with totally made up fingering because nobody had taught him, right? And then his father is like, "Oh my God." And that's when both times they responded to this initial, very unusual display of interest and prowess in a very highly structured domain, by the way. These kind of prodigies, you almost always see them in highly structured domains. Classical music playing, particularly golf, chess, not in these sort of more, open-ended domains. And honestly, I think even if our goal as a society was to make as many Tigers and Mozarts as possible, because there's no evidence that you can just create these people like out of whole cloth. Even if we wanted to create as many of those as possible, it would be to take a talent-based branching approach where you give some early exposure and see if something like lights the kids fire like that. Like, I'm sure there were other potential Tigers and Mozarts that never got, they grew up in a country that doesn't have golf or doesn't have much golf or whatever it is. So I think parents spend a lot of time worrying about missing a prodigy when those rare individuals announce themselves they're the easiest to identify because they tend to announce themselves once they've had exposure to the domain in question. So I think parents should expend less energy worrying about if they're missing, if something they just saw indicated that they might miss a Tiger or Mozart.
Did you read the book or see, and this is years ago, or see the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer?
Yeah, and I met Josh Waitzkin also.
Did you really?
In real life and talked to him.
That's why I asked. I thought maybe you did.
Yeah. And he's also a very interesting guy, and he's gotten good at a whole bunch of other stuff, like surfing and mixed martial arts, and
Yeah, it's a great story though about first of all, he found chess just like you're saying on his own, and his dad made sure he did other things for a while. I think he got a little crazy, but he went fishing with his dad and everything. You have to have that balance a little bit too. So you're talking about environment a little bit, and I know you've got the wicked and the kind learning environments. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, those are terms. I definitely didn't make those up. I took them. They were coined by a psychologist named Robin Hogarth. And what he meant by kind learning environment was domains where there are clear rules, next steps and goals are clear and like laid out for you. When you do something, you get feedback that is usually quick or sometimes immediate and accurate. And work next year will look like work last year. So golf for sure, right? Like the feedback is it's like immediate and totally accurate. Chess is all playing classical music is like that. I mean, you're not composing, but playing, you immediately know if did you hit something wrong. Chess is very much like that. So the grandmaster's advantage is largely based on knowledge of recurring patterns. And so you do have to specialize pretty early. If you haven't, among players who become competitive, if they didn't start pattern study by the age of 12, then their chance of reaching international master status, which is 1 down from grandmaster, drops from about 1 in 4 to about 1 in 55.
Wow.
Again, that's retrospectively.
David, you just got yourself like 1,000 emails from parents just from that statement.
Yeah, I know. It always surprises me. Like, parents are so fixated on pro chess or classical music. I'm like, there's a lot of other genres of music that are a lot more relevant than classical music. Why is everybody emailing me about violin? Like, what's the deal? Like the Cambridge Handbook of Expertise, which is sort of like the 10,000 Hours Bible, has a whole chapter on music, and it's like this classical study, et cetera, et cetera. And there's like 2 sentences where it's like, and all the current popular forms of music, they develop in a different trajectory. It's just like two sentence toss off. I'm like, all the stuff that isn't 300 years old, right? But anyway, so wait, what were we? Oh, chess, right? So chess is a kind learning environment based on these recurring patterns, which is also why it's so easy to automate, by the way, because computers are even better at that kind of pattern recognition. So in a lot of the domains, obviously you can automate classical music playing. In the domains where early specialization really tends to work the best, you might not want to be in those areas that much longer because they're the first things that get automated because they are these kind learning environments. Now, golf, of course, is entertainment, and human chess is still relevant because it's entertainment. But I think most of us are spending more of our time working in what Hogarth would have called the wicked learning environments, where you're not just given the next steps and goals. There may or may not be clear rules. They may change without notice. When you do things, you may or may not get feedback. The feedback may be delayed. Feedback may be inaccurate or even reinforce the wrong message. And work next year may not look like work last year. And so I think in those environments, the hyper specialized approach it can be really problematic. And in fact, there's some data that I regretted cutting out of the book that's relevant to that. That's also going in the afterword again. So I'm packing this afterword full of information.
I really love that. We have a challenge. I can only speak for my country, although I visited more than a few as a coach. Because even if we find not even a prodigy, just very talented with the physical characteristics, let's say for basketball, it helps to be tall, it helps to be long, and all that. You have to find the mentors and coaches that create that kind of environment, and we don't have many of that. When I talk to people in charge, like federations for countries, or in the case of the NBA has an office in Africa, and the guy who runs it, Amadou Fall, is a friend of mine. And when he first got the job in Senegal, and I met him through a guy named Masai Ujiri, who of course is with Toronto. We had a couple of dinners talking about this, and I said the two things you have to focus on is canvassing throw the widest net possible. Don't just take the really tall guys when they're 10, because as we know, and the history of the NBA tells you this, so many people grow late. You want to cast as wide a net as possible and get all of them to fall in love with the sport and working and learning. And then you've got to find the coaches that can build that and not just hammer, okay, you're a point guard or you're a 3-man, which is how coaches tend to think in this sport. Certainly in our country, especially, it's really problematic. So all your parents that ask you about their son, daughter who's a prodigy, it doesn't even matter if they're not in an area that has kind people that can mentor and build that environment for their child. That's the hardest thing to find.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of important stuff in what you just said. Partly, and by the way, speaking of the tall kid, so it is true that a tall kid is more likely to become a tall adult. That said, the later you go through your growth spurt, the peak height velocity in physiology lingo, the taller you're probably going to end up being. So
Absolutely.
it looks to me like Giannis looks like he went through puberty since he's been drafted, basically.
Right. So did Paul George. Paul George grew after he got drafted.
Yeah, and so I think the earlier you push selection, basically the lesson is the more likely you put the wrong person in the wrong sport or the wrong position within that sport or whatever it is. So some of these guys, I think, like Anthony Davis, have had the benefit of being short for a while, and then they, they got to learn these small guy skills. I mean, I'm super interested that Lionel Messi, the greatest soccer player in the world, is like an experiment of one who was learning really small guy skills and then was put on growth hormone when he was a kid and became sort of like normal adult height, right? So I wonder if we should consider everyone a small kid, like early on.
Nobody's looking in Africa for the next Chris Paul, right?
Yeah. Which is and it's interesting. So there's a woman named Chelsea Warr who is sort of like a mastermind behind. She was in Australia when they were awarded the Olympics in 2000 and helped like them become a dominant force. And then, so of course she got hired in England when they took over the Olympics. And there's a great book by a guy named Owen Slott about like some of what she did in those places. Not just her, but she led these teams to sort of turn around their talent pipelines. Anyway, it's Owen Slott, the gold medal project or talent project or something like that. And in large part what she did, this isn't the only thing, was diversify the pipeline. As she told me they had these terms. They say we have the fast risers and the slow bakers. The fast risers are like a LeBron, where by the time he's in his early teens, you're not worried about identifying him anymore, right? You're just worried about getting the first draft pick when he comes out.
At 15, yeah. Rick Pitino said he's going to be the first pick in the NBA draft. He wasn't supposed to say it, but he did, basically.
Right. So it was him and Sebastian Telfair, I remember, right? We're on like Slam magazine. Right. And so, 1 for 2. No, I mean, they both went to the NBA, so yeah, it's still that. But like, there's no competitive advantage in identifying LeBron at that point. Everybody's identified him.
It's not hard.
The advantage comes in these people who sort of what she calls the slow bakers, the ones who and what they realized was that so many of their Olympic champions and medalists were turning out to be these slow bakers, despite the fact that those people were often deselected early on because they weren't fast risers. They would manage to come back around and become some of the best. And so part of the program she and others helped develop was to say, what can we do to cause less deselection early on? So these people we're not disadvantaging them so much so that they become what sports scientist Ross Tucker calls ghosts, right? Where you've totally lost track of them. And that's a hard thing to do, but I think they did it really successfully and ended up getting gold medalists and even world record holders from people who were not on the radar, as of the previous Olympics, basically. And so I think diversifying that pipeline is hugely important. I mean, I think one of the things I think we don't have, I was talking to Steve Nash about this actually a couple of months ago. And because he had watched, there was an HBO Real Sports about Norwegian youth sports, and they don't allow scoring. Norway at the last Winter Olympics was arguably the greatest national performance at any Olympics ever. And it's a tiny country. And the HBO Real Sports was about how before age 12 or something, they don't even allow scoring, basically. The kids will still be competitive, but it's sort of, they're not allowed to go through all this selection. He got excited about that program because he didn't pick up a basketball till he was 13. And he was saying he was thinking about maybe starting an academy that goes according to some of those characteristics, because he knows using his name, parents who would otherwise force kids to be hyper specialized and selected very early will say well, all right, well, if Steve Nash says it's okay, then then it's okay. I think that's sort of a smart thing to think. It's very self-aware.
Right. As someone I've dedicated most of my life to trying to teach the sport, inspire people to play the sport, what you just said is as important as anything that you could possibly say for parents who don't know what to do. And mostly they don't know what to do. They don't even know where to begin in this process. I've often recommended to leagues, don't count let them shoot, let them make baskets, but don't keep track of the record. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Until you get to middle school, it doesn't matter. And all you're doing is getting kids who one day might be 6'9", they'll have long quit the game because they're not any good, because they tend to be a little bit taller and gangly and uncoordinated. But we need those guys because they get to be 6'9" or 7 foot, really athletic guys if they love the sport. They're not going to love it if they can't score and they lose every game. And we're doing a disservice to our athletes doing that.
It's tricky though, because I think in some countries, so if you look at, parents should check out that HBO Real Sports on Norway, they have a much more comprehensive sort of development idea. Whereas for us, if, I remember seeing some clips of I think it was second grade AAU national championship some years ago, and they're throwing, a ball at a 10-foot rim, what? Yeah. And the thing is, if the second grade coach's incentive is all to win the second grade national championships, then then it would just be out of the goodness of that coach's heart that they care about long-term development. Right. Whereas I think in some other places, in the UK and in Australia, where they have this centralized sports science institute that kind of disseminates knowledge and makes the lower level coaches feel like they're part of a development pipeline, not that they're evaluated based on winning the 12-year-old championships or whatever. Because if all of their incentive is just to win this year, then you sort of get what you program for. I think a lot of the deficiencies in U.S. sport development are more than covered up for the fact that we just have more athletes than everyone. We have more registered male soccer players than Brazil. I think we have 60% of all the registered female soccer players in the world. Wow. And you look at so I was a track and field athlete in college. NCAA track and field supports 30 to 40,000 young adults in serious training. If I had to guess, I'd say that's more than the rest of the world combined. So you can do things that are bad for individuals and still end up really, really good because you have so many people going. So I think we cover up a lot of our poor developmental practices by having an enormous number of athletes in the top of the funnel.
Right. We could have 3 Olympic teams win a gold medal in basketball if we actually did it the right way.
Yeah.
That's
yeah,
how
totally.
much talent there's here.
No, I mean, and we've had, again, to use the sport I was in, right? There were some track events where the person who was one spot off of making our team, would have been the national champion in like almost any other country in the world.
Yeah. Wow.
There's like, and if Steve Nash had just played basketball from age 9, he would have had likely more injuries, right? And he wouldn't have had the same brain, right? He brought a court vision to basketball that was from soccer, right? Like we would have made him worse at basketball by having him play basketball all the way throughout, right? And I don't know, we're a long way from the coach who would have had him as a 9-year-old being incentivized to kick him out of this sport to become like your army general dad, David Epstein, who's going to like rotate him through the sports. But like, it gets so white knuckle grip to like, oh, we have a talented athlete. Like, let's keep them in the sport all year. And it's just stupid.
Well, and there's a lot of stuff like, and I think one of the like sort of solutions will be to diversify within a sport a little bit. So first of all, so 2 things there. One is a problem is, again, these adult incentives, right? When I was living in Brooklyn, until not that long ago, there was a U7 travel soccer team that met right near me, right? Again, I always say, I don't think there's a person in the world who thinks that 6-year-olds can't find good enough competition in a city of 9 million people that they have to go travel, right? No, they'll probably spend more time traveling than playing.
Yeah.
But it's about the brand, right? Because and then you say, well, if they're not on the U7 travel team, then they can't be on the U8 team. And so it's like this enforced sort of pipeline. And that becomes, really problematic. So I think again, like what Steve Nash was saying, another person who's done really well with this, I think, is Judy Murray, Andy and Jamie Murray's mother. So she has a tennis camp where, because of her name, parents will say, oh, okay, we're fine taking kids out of this other developmental system and then sending them to Judy Murray. And they'll be doing stuff like, okay, they're playing tennis, but it's with some weird ball and it's through tree branches and they're trying to hit through a different branch every time. And so it looks tennis enough to satisfy parents, but it's totally diversifying the challenge. I think that's why a lot of the best, almost all of the best soccer players in the world developed on futsal, which is small ball, stays on the ground. They're playing on sand one day, cobblestones the next day, different shape pitch, different number of players packed in. So it's soccer enough, but it's really a much more diversified challenge. So I think I think what really matters is the challenge diversity. And so I think you can capture some of that within a sport if you're really intentional about it.
Have you ever studied the Williams sisters and their developmental process in tennis?
Yeah, a little bit. And by the way, I think I used the wrong word. Maybe I should say, for some people, unintentional about it, because they get too intentional and then it's all like drilling. So unstructured time. But the Williams, so I had a chance to talk to Serena Williams not that long ago, and I had not done much research on her. I figured, oh, that's the Tiger story, but I'm telling the Tiger story. So that's the one I'm using to represent because it's the most famous. But I thought that was her story. And she told me, she said, in her words, I think my father was ahead of his time. He had us doing track and field, taekwondo, karate, ballet, gymnastics, to Venus and I to learn how to overhand serve. We learned how to throw a football, which we continued to do for our warm-ups as professionals. The snap down still does that. I'd never heard that part of her story. I didn't even think to check in with her. This was after the book was published. I also want to put it, I mentioned in again, this afterward that I'm adding, but I think it just goes to show how we edit these sorts of stories. Like, no question, she had a lot of tennis development, as a young person, but she was also doing all this other stuff. And eventually, when Venus and Serena, when it was clear they were really good as teenagers, their father sort of pulled them back from the competitive circuit, kept them in school, kept them from traveling as much, because again, you don't need to travel at that point for the most part for the best
in California.
Competition. Yeah, right. Yeah. And so her story turned out to be different than what I expected to be. That's not to say that there are not those true Tiger stories, because I also met Maria Sharapova recently, and she was more of that early, actual early specialization story. She went to this academy in Russia where, again, a lot of people go into the funnel. The ones that are 3 standard deviations taller than the average woman come out the other end of the funnel sometimes. So it's not, I'm not trying to say that all of the stories, I think there's a huge amount of individual variability, but I think it's the story that people think is the norm is actually the very rare exception, basically.
Well, I have one more thing, and then I know Henry's got a few more things for you. Just more of a side note. I for many years at ESPN, I was doing chat sessions where you get a ton of questions, and I have to answer them. I try to answer about 100 questions in an hour as fast as I could.
Yeah.
And so many of them were,
Josh, I answered like 1.5 questions in an hour.
Well, yeah, that's what Chad Ford did. And I just tried to do something 3 or 4 words at best. People would always say, what do I do with my 1-year-old, my 2-year-old? And I would always just feel like, well, get them potty trained first, right? Let's get them eating solid food. I mean, let's not forget about what the most important things are. Sports can't, if you let that other stuff fall to the wayside, and I'm certain you won't be doing that. But there are parents who aren't sure. Again, they just don't know. You better have your priorities in line. It shouldn't be hard to know what those priorities should be. And if it's hard, then you need to get help as a parent because these are other things, reading, being able to order your own food at a restaurant when you're 5. You should be able to say, I want macaroni and cheese or chicken fingers, and you shouldn't be on your video game. These are things that parents should be doing, more importantly than worry about their tennis serve or their drive in a golf course or whatever.
My kid, I think, is an unusually neat sort of eater for his age. So
Prodigy.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. You beat me to it. I was going to say he's going to be the Tiger Woods of look out, he's going to be at Coney Island July 4th. That's why I've always made this joke. I'm like, the real reason I wrote this book was to eliminate the competition so my kid can become the Tiger Woods of blockchain. You know, I just want all the other parents slacking.
Clear out the playing field. That's really
exactly.
So, David, I think you said that if you're not screwing up 15% of the time, you're not challenging yourself enough. Yeah. I'm screwing up 100% of the time and telling people how to ask a question on this show. Every day, I tell Judy I'm going to do it. Every day, I blow it. Click the little chat button. Type in your question. If you'd like to ask it on video, which Gerard and Randy already have. If you'd like to do it on video, write the word video in your question. That's very helpful. Randy has a question, which is, what is the primary reason for deselecting slow risers? Why are they getting kicked out of sports?
I think one of the major reasons is that coaches mistake, and this is like pretty well proven at the junior levels, that coaches mistake biological maturation for talent and potential. So this leads to the so-called relative age effect, where you see this buildup of kids who are born early in whatever the selection year is in junior
Gladwell's
teams.
hockey thing, all the Canadian hockey players are born in January.
And what's even worse is, so he profiles it in outliers. He looks at it in up to like the junior national level. So the reason being, to explain the background, is the selection I think he was writing about was occurring at like age 7 at the start. And so the coaches just a kid who's born, you know, in let's say the selection year started according to the calendar, to a normal calendar year, then a kid who was born in January of the selection year is a year older than a kid who's born in December of that selection year. And when you're 7, that's a tremendous difference in your motor skills, your maturity, and all those things. And so, by the way, this goes in school for kids who are born late in a selection year, are way more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, but they're just behaving like younger kids that they are. And so the coaches will say, like, this kid's talented because maybe they're a lot bigger or their motor skills are a lot more developed, but they're actually just seeing a kid who's more biologically mature. And so again, in the Netherlands, in their soccer development, which has been, you know, quite good, they stopped allowing coaches from deselecting kids unless the kid had hit peak height velocity, because of what they would notice. And they kept someone in who went on to become in their team that made the World Cup final, who was going to be deselected because they're like, oh, he's got some skill, but he's not that big. And they said, well, he hasn't hit his growth spurt yet. And so a lot of it, I think, is you deselect kids before you even know they're going to become. You mistake what you're seeing right now for like a terminally stable trajectory, right? We're used to seeing if one person's here and one person's here, we think our intuition is they're going to stay that far apart forever. But that in fact is not the case. Even up to the pro level, that's like not the case. Like people, the rank order of how good people are changes. Otherwise the draft would be super easy if people stayed. So I think that's a really major reason, probably the single biggest reason that deselection hurts. But another one is just that we enforce exclusivity before we have to, just because it's like nice for branding.
Right. We have used a lot of time already. And there's one thing I just feel like we would be remiss if we didn't get you to talk about, which is early success with one technique hurts your likelihood of encountering a different technique. I said that early. You know what I mean?
Sorry, can you say it again? I lost you for like a half sentence
Oh,
there.
yeah, no problem. Basically, like, I think my connection is not great, but if you are successful using one technique, it impairs your ability to transition to a different technique. Can you explain that more?
Oh yeah, so some interesting research in like problem solving that shows
Right.
if you set someone up so that they will solve a problem in a certain way and then reward them for it, you will impair their ability to find like multiple different solutions when a challenge changes. So people who are successful early and rewarded for it will keep doing the same thing even when the challenge changes. Whereas people you bring in who are naive to that challenge will find like different strategies because one hasn't been reinforced as a thing over and over and over. So you really want challenge diversity. And this goes to this sort of classical summary of an area of research that applies to motor skills and to cognitive skills. The saying is breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. Transfer is the term psychologists use to mean taking knowledge and applying it to problems you haven't quite seen before, right? So if you think in sports, as the level gets higher, you have to take things that you learned and apply them in new ways because the challenge is getting more difficult. And what predicts your ability to do that is how broad the challenges you've faced, the things that you've tried in training are, because that forces you, instead of relying on a singular strategy that's worked before, to build these more conceptual models that are flexible to the challenges that are coming. And this has been shown in military air traffic controllers, all sorts of challenges, athletes. And so I think you really want to set up systems that force someone to diversify their approach to a problem. Otherwise, they will use the same thing over and over and over. Even when the challenge changes, they'll keep doing that. So there's something called the Einstellung effect, which is this inability to move off a strategy that worked in the past if you've done it too much, even if the challenge changes.
So this is where I feel like when I read that part of the book, the most common way an NBA player fails is that they were bigger, stronger, and faster than everybody every second before the NBA, and then weren't anymore, right? So this is actually interesting. I had this conversation at the D League All-Star game. So these are the players who just didn't quite work out in the NBA, but are still really good. But almost everyone on the court was bigger than everyone or faster than everyone they played against in high school or college. And so that was their solution.
Yeah.
Right? They didn't
Yeah.
have to recognize what the defense was doing. They didn't have to decipher every single aspect of the game. They didn't have to like atomize it. They didn't have to Steve Nash the game, right? They just got to be better because of the tool they had was very known. And then they'd stop being bigger and stop being stronger and stop being faster. And so now we're testing for the first time, can you develop new solutions? And some do beautifully, right? Those are stars, but some don't.
Yeah, I think that really gets to go back to, we were talking about relative age effect in hockey and Gladwell writing about that in Outliers. If you look at the NHL level for Canadians, that relative age effect, the early overrepresentation of people earlier in the birth year, disappears. And you start to see a slight overrepresentation of the second half of the year.
Right.
And I think that's probably because those kids, despite being disadvantaged, some of them are forced to come up with these sort of alternate strategies. And so more of the all-stars and things are born actually later in the year. So sometimes I think it can be, if you don't get fully deselected, it can be kind of a blessing in disguise not to have that advantage too early, right? And again,
Well,
we
the
were
thing about med school, like the people in the first year, can you talk about that? You know what I'm talking about?
No, it's good. Go a little more.
So my memory is bad, but the kids who are succeeding in the first year of med school, when it's like tests and your individual knowledge and like, succeed, but then as med school goes on, it's more about rounds and diagnoses and teamwork, then it shifts who's ahead.
Yeah. I mean, and it kind of turns out that like some of the things that happen early on are like not at all predictive of what people are going to do in the actual job, which is not so good. And I think there's movements to change some of that. But that's been shown actually in a couple domains. I think I was looking at a study of business students and it was finding that some of the characteristics that predicted like doing well in certain aspects of class were negatively correlated with their income later on, which if they're in business school, like sort of things like excessive rule following and stuff like that, where they would do good on these really well-defined tasks. Yeah. And then you get out in the world where the tasks are not as well defined, basically. Right. And so some of that just doing what you're told can actually become, not so good when you have to like create new stuff. So
interesting. We have used a lot of time. I think that we have to get Gerard on here. He was a swimming coach and he wants to talk about swimming. And it's our religious tradition of the show that he comes on every time and asks a question.
Cool.
Let's do that. I think Judy's going to push the magic button.
Here he is. He's coming.
What's up, guys?
Hey.
So I was a swimming coach, and I coached athletes that made Olympic trials and super high level, and that was well before Gladwell's book came out and well before your book came out. And one of the challenges that we had as coaches was always, you have that preternatural 12 or 13-year-old girl that's really fast and really good, and you're like, should we keep her, allowing her to do these other sports or these other activities, when you see this track of like, we can make trials and we can, and for female athletes, particularly in a sport like swimming, look, she may never make the Olympic team, but if she gets Olympic trial cuts, that's a college scholarship, and that's where, you know what I mean? So it was this weird sort of like, should we allow you to have more fun? But what I found over time is the ones that we allowed to have much more variance in their training and do different things, tended to either last longer in the sport and enjoy it more, versus the others. And even variance within their training, right? Maybe it's like, okay, you've been distanced for like a couple of years. We're going to train you like a middle distance swimmer now or something like that. So just like you're talking about variance in training, I think is interesting.
That's a great point. I mean, again, and that's why I think that may be sort of one of the solutions, because, without like kicking them out of a sport they're doing well in, trying to diversify the challenges they're facing within that sport. Because I think you articulated one of the really, really difficult challenges, especially in the US, where you have a large number of people competing for scholarships, which can truncate the developmental pipeline. So, I mean, again, in the U.S., we have this incredible swimming community, right? Like we have a lot of people engaged in the sport, the NCAA system, et cetera. And even to go younger than that. So I was sort of, speaking in implicitly negative way about coaches trying to win the 12-year-old championships or whatever it is earlier. Yep. Maybe for some kids, winning the 12-year-old championship might be like the best sports experience they're ever going to have. So I wouldn't say, so I don't want to totally rag on that, but I think that's this tremendous challenge of conforming to a selection and development pipeline that is timed basically for when college coaches want to start offering scholarships, and not necessarily timed for what's ideal for the athlete. And boy, that balance is, I think that's one of many things that gets to like the art of coaches, and why like we'll never, ever, ever be able to like science away coaches, no matter how much we know about athlete development, because I think it just has to be someone who knows the athletes psychologically, knows them outside of the sport, what kind of milieu are they in their life in general. And so I think that's like this, the case by case sort of trying to balance risk and reward that's part of what great coaches do.
Yeah, I mean, because swimming's a year-round sport. I mean, I've given athletes summers off in like critical points of their, but just because you know them and you just know, what they need, you've got that relationship, you can just tell. And Coach Thorpe, this as well, like, especially when they're younger, you can see them teetering, and it's like teetering not in that good way, and you got to pull them back, right? And it's just, but it's hard because you see, God, you're going to be so good, but for their ultimate long-term benefit, we'll sacrifice the short term. All right, you're not going to win this thing. We're not going to get our cuts in December or whatever. We'll get them next time we go out. But that's that challenge as a coach.
Yeah. I mean, I think to me, part of what, like the less marketable, but in some ways more accurate subtitle of what my book would have been was like, sometimes the things you can do to cause the most rapid short-term advantage can undermine the longer-term development. Yep. And then how do you think about balancing those things? And I think that's
when some of these kids are on their like, 1000th time they're getting up early to go to practice, and they're looking at like somebody's surfing out the window or rock climbing or something, and part of me is like, just pull over and do that already. Like you don't at 12 years old, you don't have to go to your 1000th practice. Like it's not helping anything, right?
I mean, I think one of the interesting things I think was that so I spent some time with a physiologist for Cirque du Soleil. And they have incredible physiology data, because they have all these, a lot of their performers were Olympic athletes, gymnasts, or trampoline, or, and they have like biometric vests on and stuff like that. So they have this incredible data. And one of the things they decided to try have performers learn the basics of several other performers' disciplines, not because they were going to use them, but they were looking at this data that suggested that if you like diversify your movement patterns, you'll make someone more durable. And they compare their injury rates to Canadian Gymnastics, this Canadian company, and they found it dropped their injury rates by like almost a third.
Wow.
And so they kept up with that. We can speculate about why that is, right? Does it work these support muscles that you're not working if you're doing the same thing over and over? I don't know. They don't know. That seems like reasonable speculation to me, but the fact was when they diversified some of the movement patterns, people became more durable. And I think there's something to that, whether you do that within the sport, whether you do that by letting them do something outside of the sport. I think that's a coaching challenge, but I think there's a durability benefit that like keeps showing up more and more and more when athletes are studied over time.
Awesome. Brilliant. David, thank you so much. Thanks for saving the world with the coronavirus thing.
You've been helping me with that. You keep underplaying your role. You've,
really nice.
we were playing phone. We like had a back and forth like multi-step telephone game yesterday of.
Well, no, but let me explain. Like, I don't know how anything works, but I trust that you did a lot of homework. So when you said, "Hey, I think this," there's a million things on Twitter about like potential therapies, and you're like, "No, I think this one really matters." I was like, "Oh, good." Like somebody who actually knows about science can like shine the light here, because like I wasn't going to pick this one. I don't know if Arturo is the right person to believe in, but you do, and so thank you for doing that. That's
I mean, they still need to do the trials, I should say, but I think it's very. I mean,
it's gonna be fine.
Yeah, once the National Academies of Science and Medicine and Engineering identified it as especially promising, I think that means at least we should go through the trials.
My standard is when David Epstein says it's good.
Right.
Like,
That's right. That's what I meant. Once I said it. But even if it doesn't end up becoming like the therapy, the worst case scenario is that the donor blood is still going to help. So
true.
The worst case scenario is, hopefully that won't be the worst case scenario. But
when you were on the day that we made tacos, I pinned you down and you said 60% odds this became like a broadly used useful therapy. What are the odds today?
I think a little higher. I'm going to go with 65 today because I think it's I think one of the most promising things is they're starting a trial to use it for healthcare workers prophylactically to see if you give it to a bunch of healthcare workers, will fewer of them get infected. I don't think anybody thinks that none of them would get infected, but will fewer of them get infected? And I think until we have like a vaccine, which is going to be a while, probably there's not much else that can be tried quickly in that way.
And is there any evidence yet of anyone receiving this therapy and having an adverse effect?
No. So that's a great thing, right? That's not to say that it couldn't happen, but so far so good. And that's been the case for this in the past. And blood transfusion is very highly regulated. So we already have all of these academic centers already have in place, these very highly regulated systems for doing a lot of this stuff. So it's not like they're starting from scratch with a lot of this. The only starting from scratch part is the specific antibodies for COVID.
We're way over time, but we still have one more question from Bilal. I'd love to get to you. He says, are we seeing that breadth of skills in the current pandemic?
So this project that Henry is talking about got started by a guy that I sort of profiled in the last chapter of Range because he was such a polymath. So he's
McDonald's.
Yeah, he's the head of immunology and microbiology at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, which is probably the most prestigious one in the world. And he has a degree in pest control hanging right beside his induction to the National Academy of Sciences, because his father always wanted him to something to fall back on. He worked at McDonald's for like 4 years and thought it was an amazing experience. He worked as a bank teller in both places, got held up. His brother was taken hostage in one. And he talks about how that, really gave him experience in acting under pressure and communicating with someone under duress and things like that. And he's this incredible polymath. He makes sure to read something outside of his field every day. That in fact is this is sort of in his field, but he was reading history of science, which is how he knew that before vaccines that this blood plasma treatment was used. And because he's worked on so many different, probably the single most important thing, I think, is that he's worked in so many different sort of areas related to his work that he had so many contacts in different fields that he was able to pull together a national collaboration in like a week because he had dabbled in so many different areas and worked with so many different teams. And I think minus that, they had a team conference call yesterday. And at the end, he said, I just want to point out there's an unprecedented collaboration, 34 centers, pharmaceutical companies, Amazon logistics, all this stuff. Amazon's helping with logistics. And he said, the government hasn't had anything to do with this yet. I mean, other than the FDA has approved some of it. There's no nonprofit running us. This is all grassroots, us just like collectively forming into a national partnership. And I think that the way they were able to do that was a few people on the leadership team had dabbled in so many different areas that they had a broader view of what this team could look like and how it could be assembled. And I think that's been essential to them getting off the ground.
Awesome. Well, that's a great answer to that question, huh? I like that.
Yeah, amazing.
All right, you guys. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow, 11 o'clock. Every weekday, bring it in. David.
Henry. Thanks, guys.